Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling the story about the arrest and detention of the former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan. And we've got some recent news reports here to kind of sift through, and believe me, it's complicated.
It's really captivating how this case just goes beyond Pakistani politics.
Yeah.
You see U.S. foreign policy, human rights, that precarious balance of power, and it's all in a region that's super strategically important.
Yeah, you might be thinking, why should I care about Pakistani politics? But hold on tight, because this deep dive is about way more than just one leader.
Right.
It's about international relations. It's about these delicate power plays. And there are even hints about potential U.S. involvement.
Oh, yeah?
So let's unpack this, starting with Imran Khan himself. I mean, he is a bit of a polarizing figure, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. So, before we even talk about politics, you got to remember this guy was a cricket superstar in Pakistan. It's almost like if Babe Ruth became president here in the U.S.
What?
It's crazy. And that celebrity gave him this platform, but he was also known for being pretty outspoken, especially his criticism of U.S. drone strikes in the region. He would call them counterproductive and harmful to civilians. And that stance alone alienated a lot of folks in Washington.
Speaking of controversy, he also led some pretty massive protests after being ousted from power in 2022, right?
Yeah, so he was removed through a vote of no confidence.
Okay.
And this is a process where the majority of parliament members vote to remove a prime minister. And of course, Khan claimed this was orchestrated by the military, by his opponents, and his supporters just flooded the streets,
Wow.
demanding he be reinstated. It really showed his charisma. Like, he had the power to mobilize people even after he lost power.
So if he was so popular, why is he in jail now? This is where things take a turn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In August 2023, Khan was arrested on a bunch of corruption charges. Over 100, to be exact.
100.
Over 100. And he claims they're politically motivated. He thinks they're just trying to keep him from running in the upcoming elections. It's worth noting that his relationship with Pakistan's powerful military, it's incredibly strained.
I bet.
He's openly accused them of interfering with politics and basically being the reason he got kicked out. So you see this intense power struggle just playing out in the open.
Wow. Talk about high stakes. And then there's the U.S. Congress stepping into the picture. Over 60 Democratic lawmakers sent a letter to President Biden urging him to, use U.S. influence to secure Khan's release.
It's wild, right?
This is pretty remarkable considering Khan's history of criticizing the U.S. What do you make of that?
It's surprising, especially given his past rhetoric.
Yeah.
However, this is the first time that Congress has collectively called for Khan's release. And so it signals a potential shift, right? Maybe U.S. priorities are changing, perhaps driven by concerns about, Pakistan's political stability and the ripple effects across the whole region.
It's like the U.S. is saying, we may not agree with everything Khan says, but we're worried about how his arrest is impacting Pakistani democracy. But let's rewind for a second and address those allegations of election irregularities.
Okay.
What exactly is raising red flags for the U.S.?
Well, there have been these reports of irregularities in the recent Pakistani elections. Things like voter suppression and intimidation.
Really?
And these claims haven't just come from Khan's supporters either. You've got international observers from the U.S., the U.K., the EU, even the United Nations, and they've expressed concern.
Wow.
And here's the kicker. Khan was barred from even participating. And his party still got the most seats.
His party won even without him on the ballot.
Yeah.
That's a pretty strong indicator that something might be amiss.
It certainly raises some questions about the fairness of the process. And when you connect this back to Khan's arrest, it's not hard to see why some might believe he was targeted to try to, curb his party's growing influence.
So if the U.S. is concerned about fair elections and the UN is stating that Khan's detention might violate international law, what's stopping them from taking a more, assertive stance?
That's the million-dollar question. The U.S. has a lot of leverage over Pakistan,
Right.
particularly when it comes to foreign aid and military cooperation.
Yeah.
But there's always a risk of unintended consequences. If the U.S. applies too much pressure, it could fuel anti-American sentiment within Pakistan and potentially even turn Khan into a martyr for his supporters.
It's a delicate balancing act. You don't want to create more instability in a region that's already struggling with a ton of challenges.
Exactly.
And remember, Pakistan is a nuclear-armed country.
Right.
So any misstep by the U.S. could have huge consequences for regional security.
Absolutely.
So we've got a popular yet controversial ex-leader in jail, allegations of political maneuvering, international anxiety over human rights and democracy, and a nuclear-armed nation navigating a precarious political landscape.
It's a situation that requires really careful examination and a nuanced understanding.
Well said. Now, before we get into the human rights implications of Khan's arrest and explore what the future might hold for Pakistan, let's take a quick pause. We were just talking about that complex situation surrounding Imran Khan's arrest and all the concerns raised by the international community. Now let's shift focus a little bit to the human rights dimension of this case.
Yeah.
You mentioned the UN's stance that Khan's detention might actually be a violation of international law.
Yeah.
Could you unpack that a little? What specific violations are being highlighted?
Well, you have this group called the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention.
Hmm.
It's basically independent human rights experts. And they looked into this case and concluded that Khan's arrest and detention don't have, a solid legal basis.
Hmm.
And they say it might be breaking international human rights standards.
Okay, so it's not just about whether Khan's guilty or innocent of those charges. It's whether he's being treated fairly.
Right.
They're talking about things like due process, the right to a fair trial, freedom of expression,
Yeah.
all really essential pillars of a functioning democracy. So it sounds like the UN is taking this pretty seriously.
Absolutely. And their statement, it goes beyond just Khan's case, right? They're worried about Pakistan's commitment to upholding the rule of law, respecting human rights. It's something that could really impact their international standing and relationships with other countries.
That makes sense. If a country is seen as, just routinely violating human rights, it's going to be hard for them to build trust and cooperation with other nations.
Yeah.
But what about those in Pakistan who support Khan's arrest?
Yeah.
They must have reasons for believing he should be held accountable.
You're right. We've got to acknowledge the different perspectives in Pakistan. Some people say that Khan's actions while in office, they deserved investigation and prosecution. They're pointing to things like allegations of corruption, misuse of power, mismanaging the economy during his time as prime minister.
So it's not just a clear-cut good guy versus bad guy situation.
It's never that simple in geopolitics. There are real concerns about corruption and accountability in Pakistan. And those are issues that need to be addressed. But the way Khan was targeted, it raises questions about, is the legal system fair? Is he being persecuted for political reasons?
Yeah.
It makes people uneasy, especially considering he was arrested right before elections.
It sounds like there's just a lot of distrust in the system at play here. What are the potential consequences if Pakistan just ignores these international concerns about, human rights and democratic processes?
Well, if those concerns are ignored, it could lead to Pakistan being isolated on the international stage. They might face economic sanctions, they might see less foreign investment, their reputation could be damaged, and that would make it harder to trade or, work diplomatically with other nations.
And that would end up hurting the everyday people of Pakistan the most.
Exactly. It's usually the citizens who bear the brunt of the economic hardship and political instability.
We've talked about unrest, potential for economic fallout. But what about the human side of all of this? What's life like for ordinary Pakistanis with all of this going on?
For a lot of Pakistanis, it's a really uncertain and anxious time. The economy is tough, inflation is high, and more people are just disillusioned with the whole political system. And Khan's arrest has just added fuel to the fire. The nation's more divided. There's more unrest.
It's hard to imagine just trying to live your life, raise a family, run a business with all of that hanging over you.
It really does show you the human cost of political turmoil and how important it is to find peaceful solutions to these really complicated problems.
So given this backdrop of uncertainty and unrest, what are some possible scenarios that might unfold in Pakistan in the coming months? What possibilities should we be keeping an eye on?
Well, one scenario is that Khan just stays in detention. His legal challenges fail, and he can't participate in future elections. And that could just make tensions worse, right? More protests, more unrest, potentially even violence. It could really polarize Pakistani society.
That sounds pretty bad. Are there any, alternative paths that could lead to a less chaotic outcome?
It is possible that all this pressure from the international community and even domestic pressure might force the Pakistani government to rethink things. They might offer Khan some sort of concession, maybe a conditional release, or, A guarantee of a fair trial, like
Yeah.
what the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention suggested,
Okay.
which, by the way, that holds a lot of weight.
Right.
They could actually refer cases to the UN Human Rights Council.
Wow.
So that could lead to further action. And a move like that could really help to de-escalate the situation.
So there's some hope that, diplomacy and dialogue could lead to a more peaceful resolution. But let's not forget about the elephant in the room, the Pakistani military. Given their history with Khan, their stance on this issue is going to be a deciding factor, right?
Totally. If they see Khan as a threat to their power, they're not going to be eager to see him released. And that brings us back to the U.S. and its role in all of this.
Okay, so let's circle back to the U.S. involvement.
Right.
We know Congress is pushing Biden to act. But what are his options, really? And how might Pakistan react to U.S. pressure?
The U.S. has a few tools it can use, right?
Yeah.
Diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, maybe even reducing military aid. But like we talked about, each of those has its risks.
You don't want to push Pakistan so hard that you alienate them or push them closer to countries like China or Russia. It's a tough balancing act. Is there a way for the U.S. to promote its interests and its values, but still respect Pakistan's sovereignty and not do anything that could make the region even less stable?
That's the million-dollar question.
Hmm.
The U.S. needs to find that sweet spot, a measured approach that encourages Pakistan to, stick to democratic norms and human rights without making things worse.
Yeah.
It takes a real understanding of Pakistani politics and society.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners will glean from this complicated situation?
I think the main thing to remember is this is far from over. Things are changing all the time. This has the potential to change regional and even global dynamics. It's so important to stay informed, think critically about the information we're getting, and talk about these challenges facing Pakistan and the world, really.
Absolutely. We can't just ignore these things, even if they seem far away. As we've seen in this deep dive, stuff happening on the other side of the world can affect our lives too.
I totally agree. And as this story keeps going, it's important to ask the tough questions, look at different viewpoints, and keep looking for those peaceful and just solutions.
Well said. And on that note, we want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question. We've talked about what might happen if Pakistan keeps going down this road, ignoring these international concerns about human rights and democracy. But let's flip it around. Could pressure from the U.S. and other countries actually help to get Khan released? Or could it backfire and just solidify the current situation?
That's a tough one. There's no easy answer. And it's something that will definitely keep being debated as things unfold. The stakes are incredibly high, and the way forward is full of complexity.
For sure. This is a situation that needs careful thought, nuanced understanding, and a commitment to finding peaceful and fair solutions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Pakistani politics. We encourage you to learn more about this and stay involved with events that shape our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.